4 people sat around a long table covered with white cloth and candles. Everyone was smiling. Everyone was celebrating my sister's engagement. And right in the middle of that dinner, my mother laughed and said something that made the entire room go quiet. She looked at the groom's family, pointed toward me, and said, "Don't mind her. That's our other daughter. She just cleans houses." Some people chuckled politely. My father didn't laugh. He took a sip of his drink and added calmly, "We stopped expecting much from her years ago." 30 guests heard that. But no one heard it louder than I did. Because the truth was something my parents never bothered to learn. The girl who cleans houses was the founder of a cleaning company that operated in 14 states. And sitting across the table from me was a woman who knew that very well. The groom's mother. Her name was Margaret Dalton. And in less than 10 minutes, she was going to say something that would drain every bit of color from my mother's face. But before I tell you what happened that night, let me introduce myself. My name is Elena Carter. I'm 32 years old. And the story you're about to hear is the moment I finally stopped begging my family to see me. Let's go back to that night. Saturday evening. Early September. The engagement dinner for my younger sister Emily Carter. The restaurant was called Riverside House. In our small town of Pine Hollow, Ohio, it was considered fancy. White tablecloths. Soft jazz playing through the speakers. And wine bottles that cost more than most people in town would ever admit to paying. When I stepped inside at 6:45 p.m., the room was already full. My mother, Linda Carter, was laughing loudly with guests. My father, Daniel, was sitting near the head of the table like a quiet statue. Emily was glowing beside her fiancé Ryan Dalton. And then there was me. The daughter no one knew how to introduce. When my mother noticed me standing in the doorway, she paused for a second. Not smiling. Not surprised. Just slightly annoyed. "Oh," she said. "You made it." She looked around the table and pointed to a small round table near the window. "You can sit over there." I glanced at the main table. There was an empty seat beside my sister. But my mother's purse was sitting in it. She didn't move it. So I walked to the small table by the window and sat alone. At that moment, I had no idea the woman across the room was studying my face carefully. Trying to remember where she had seen me before. And when she finally figured it out, everything in that room was about to change. But to understand why, you need to know how I became the family disappointment in the first place. And trust me, that story started a very long time ago. I'll tell you how I went from the miracle adopted child to the daughter my parents were embarrassed to claim, and the moment that changed my life forever. I wasn't born into the Carter family. I was chosen. At least, that's what everyone used to say. When Linda and Daniel Carter adopted me, people in our town treated them like heroes. Pine Hollow was a small place where everyone knew everyone's business, and an adoption story like mine spread fast. At church, neighbors would smile and say things like, "You two are such wonderful people." Pastor Miller mentioned it during Sunday service more than once. Little Elena is proof of the Carter family's generous hearts. For the first few years of my life, I was the center of everything. My mother carried me everywhere. My drawings covered the refrigerator. Every holiday photo had me sitting proudly between my parents. I believed them when they said I was their miracle. But miracles don't stay miracles forever. When I was 4 years old, my parents had their biological daughter, Emily. I still remember the day they brought her home from the hospital. Everyone crowded around the baby carrier. My mother cried tears of happiness. My father looked prouder than I had ever seen him. At first, I thought we were all celebrating together. But slowly, things started changing. My room moved from the second floor to the attic. The drawings I taped to the refrigerator disappeared. The framed photo of Emily's hospital bracelet replaced them. The baby seat in the car took the place where mine used to be. No one ever explained it. No one ever said the words out loud. But the house began to revolve around Emily. By the time I was 10 years old, the story everyone told about our family was clear. Emily was the golden child. She danced in recitals. She brought home perfect report cards. My mother proudly told neighbors, "That's our girl." And me? I became the other one. The child who didn't quite fit. The one my mother described with a polite smile and a quiet sigh. "We tried our best with Elena," she would say at the mailbox. "Some things just aren't in the blood." My father never corrected her. Not once. He would sit in his chair reading the newspaper while my mother spoke for both of them. And that silence said more than any cruel sentence ever could. Because when one parent attacks you and the other stays quiet, it feels like they both agreed. I learned something early in that house. Love had rules. It had expectations. And if you didn't meet them, you slowly disappeared. But there was one thing my parents never noticed about me. Something that would change my entire life years later. They never noticed how hard I was willing to work. And that quiet determination would eventually take me far away from Pine Hollow. But first, I had to survive high school. And the day I graduated was the moment I realized something painful. My family had already decided who I was going to be. And they were very sure it wouldn't be anyone important. But they were about to be very wrong. I'll tell you about the day I left home with 2 bags, $400, and a job cleaning houses, the job my parents were so ashamed of. I graduated from Creek Hollow High School on a warm Tuesday afternoon. Rows of folding chairs filled the football field. Parents were cheering, cameras were flashing, and everyone seemed excited about the future. Except me. Because when I looked into the crowd, the 2 seats that should have been filled were empty. My mother wasn't there. My father wasn't there either. Emily had a dance competition that day in another town, and according to my mother, it was too important to miss. My father told me he would try to come. He didn't. I walked across the stage, shook the principal's hand, and accepted my diploma while pretending it didn't matter that no one from my family was there. But the truth was, it mattered. That night, I went home, packed 2 duffel bags, and quietly left the house where I had spent 18 years trying to belong. I moved into a tiny studio apartment above a laundromat in Greenfield, a town about 40 minutes away. The place smelled like detergent all the time. The ceiling leaked when it rained. And the mattress on the floor was thinner than a blanket. But it was mine. I had exactly $500 in savings. Money I earned from years of babysitting. To survive, I enrolled in community college night classes. During the day, I took the only job I could find. Cleaning houses. It wasn't glamorous. Not even close. My days were filled with scrubbing toilets, wiping kitchen grease, vacuuming carpets, and digging hair out of shower drains. Sometimes I came home so tired I fell asleep without eating. But every dollar I earned felt different. Because for the first time in my life, no one could say I didn't deserve it. Meanwhile, back in Pine Hollow, my mother told people a very different story. "Emily starts at State University next month," she would proudly say. Then she would add, almost as an afterthought, "Elena chose a different path." She always said different the way people talk about something disappointing. Like a problem she couldn't fix. I still called home sometimes during those early years. Mostly on Sundays. My mother usually said she was busy. My father rarely answered. One day, after working for almost 2 years, I did something that meant a lot to me. I applied for a real business license. When the document arrived in the mail, I stared at it for a long time. My name printed clearly at the top. It was the first official thing I had ever built for myself. I took a picture of it and sent it to my mother. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. Her reply had only one word. Cute. That was it. No congratulations. No questions. Just cute. That night, I almost gave up. I almost packed my bags and drove back to Pine Hollow, ready to apologize for chasing a dream that apparently meant nothing. But the next day, something happened that changed everything. I met a woman who saw something in me that my own parents never did. Her name was Mrs. Eleanor Whitman. And she would become the reason my small cleaning job turned into something much bigger. But neither she nor I had any idea how big it would become. I'll tell you about the first client who changed my life and planted the idea that would eventually turn my bucket and sponge into a multi-state company. My first regular client lived on Blackstreet. Her name was Mrs. Eleanor Whitman. She was 74 years old, lived alone in a small white house with blue shutters, and always wore soft sweaters that smelled like lavender. The first time I cleaned her home, I was nervous. I was still new to the job, still learning how to run a small business by myself. I brought a bucket, a mop, a few cleaning sprays, and a notebook where I wrote down every dollar I earned. Mrs. Whitman opened the door with a warm smile. "You must be Elena," she said gently. "Come in, dear." Her house was neat but dusty in places. The kitchen tiles needed scrubbing, the bathroom needed serious attention, and the windows had fingerprints everywhere. I worked for nearly 4 hours that day. Scrubbing. Wiping. Polishing every corner until it looked brand new. When I finished, I stood in the doorway with my bucket in my hand, unsure if she would be happy with the results. Mrs. Whitman walked slowly through each room. She looked at the kitchen counters. She checked the windows. Then she turned toward me and smiled. "Goodness," she said. "I haven't seen my house look this clean in years." I felt something warm in my chest. Pride. Real pride. She handed me my payment and then surprised me by pouring 2 glasses of iced tea. "Sit for a minute," she said. We sat at her small kitchen table. After a moment, she asked a question no one had ever asked me before. "Why are you doing this job by yourself?" I shrugged. "It's the only work I could find." She shook her head slowly. "No, honey," she said. "That's not what I mean." She leaned forward slightly. "You clean better than half the companies I've hired over the years." Then she said something that would stay in my mind forever. "You shouldn't just clean houses. You should run a company that cleans houses." I laughed nervously. "A company?" I said. "I'm barely paying rent." Mrs. Whitman smiled again. "Every big business starts somewhere," she said. "Sometimes it starts with a broom." That sentence planted a small idea in my mind. At first it felt impossible. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Over the next few months, Mrs. Whitman told her friends about me. Then those friends told their friends. Soon I wasn't cleaning 1 house a week. I was cleaning 5. Then 10. Then more than I could handle by myself. So I hired my first helper. Then another. And slowly, piece by piece, something small began turning into something real. But back in Pine Hollow, my parents still believed I was just a girl struggling to survive. They had no idea the cleaning job they were embarrassed by was quietly becoming a business. A business that would eventually spread far beyond our small town. 14 years later, that business would bring me right back to Pine Hollow. Back to that engagement dinner. Back to the moment my mother decided to humiliate me in front of 30 people. And the moment someone else decided to tell the truth. But before that night, there was one phone call I almost didn't answer. And if I hadn't answered it, None of what happened at that dinner would have happened at all. I'll tell you about the invitation that brought me back to Pine Hollow, and the warning my mother gave me before the dinner even started. 14 years passed faster than I expected. The tiny cleaning job that started with a bucket and sponge had grown into something much bigger. I hired more workers. Then supervisors. Then managers. Eventually, my company opened offices in other cities. Then other states. I didn't build it overnight. It took years of mistakes, long nights, and more stress than I ever imagined. But slowly, quietly, Whitman Clean Living became something real. By the time I turned 32, the company operated in 14 states. We had dozens of teams and a reputation for being reliable. But there was one thing that never changed. My family never knew. Not really. I stopped trying to tell them. Every time I shared a small success, my mother brushed it aside. So eventually, I stopped sharing. My life continued far away from Pine Hollow. Until one afternoon in early September. A cream-colored envelope arrived in my mailbox. The handwriting on the front was familiar. Inside was an invitation. Emily Carter and Ryan Dalton. Engagement dinner. Saturday, September 14th. Riverside House. 6 p.m. I stared at the card for a long time. I hadn't attended a family event in years. Not because I wasn't invited. But because I knew exactly how those gatherings usually went. Polite smiles. Awkward conversations. And subtle reminders that I wasn't the daughter my parents were proud of. While I was still holding the invitation, my phone rang. My mother. I answered slowly. Elena, she said immediately, her voice brisk. We need to talk about Saturday. Something in her tone made my stomach tighten. What about it? I asked. She sighed like the conversation was already exhausting. The Dalton family is very respectable, she said. Ryan's mother runs a successful business. Important people will be there. I waited. Then she finally said what she really meant. I don't want you drawing attention. I frowned. What does that mean? Well, she hesitated. Just don't talk about your work. My work? The cleaning thing, she said quickly. It's not exactly the kind of impression we want to make. For a few seconds, I held the phone away from my ear and just stared at the wall. You don't want me to mention my job, I repeated. I just want you to blend in, she said. That's all. Blend in. That phrase sounded very familiar. It was the same message I had heard my entire life. Don't stand out. Don't embarrass us. Don't remind people you exist. I almost told her I wasn't coming. Honestly, that would have been easier. But before I could answer, another call came through later that evening. Emily. My sister rarely called me directly. When I answered, her voice was quiet. Hey, she said softly. Please come on Saturday. I hesitated. Why? I asked. There was a long pause. Because you're my sister, she said. Something in her voice sounded sincere. Like the little girl who used to sneak into my attic bedroom during thunderstorms when we were kids. And for a moment, I remembered that version of Emily. I'll be there, I finally said. What I didn't know yet was that someone else would also be at that dinner. Someone who already knew exactly who I was. And when she finally recognized me, everything my parents believed about me would collapse in front of 30 witnesses. But first, I had to walk into that restaurant and sit at the table where I had always been the family embarrassment. I'll tell you what happened when I arrived at the engagement dinner, and why my mother made sure I sat as far away from the main table as possible. I arrived at Riverside House at 6:47 p.m. The sun was just beginning to set, and the restaurant windows reflected the warm orange light of early evening. For Pine Hollow, this place was considered fancy. White tablecloths. Soft jazz playing quietly overhead. Fresh flowers in glass vases. When I stepped inside the private dining room, about 30 people were already there. My mother, Linda Carter, stood near the center of the room laughing loudly with a group of guests. She always laughed a little louder when she wanted people to notice her. My father, Daniel, sat near the head of the long table with a glass of bourbon in his hand. Emily sat beside her fiancé Ryan Dalton, glowing with excitement. For a moment, I wondered if anyone would even notice I had arrived. Then my mother glanced toward the doorway. Her expression didn't brighten. It didn't darken either. It simply paused. "Oh," she said casually. "You made it." No hug. No smile. Just those two words. She looked around the room quickly, then pointed toward a small round table near the window. "There's a seat over there," she said. "The main table's full." I glanced at the long table. There were plenty of chairs. In fact, there was one empty seat right beside Emily. But sitting on that chair was my mother's cream-colored purse. She noticed me looking. And she didn't move it. The message was clear. So I walked to the small round table by the window and sat down. Next to me was a distant cousin whose name I barely remembered. He was already halfway through his second beer and nodded politely before returning to his phone. From that seat, I could see the entire room. But no one was really looking at me. And I realized something. This wasn't an accident. My mother had placed me there on purpose. Far enough away that I wouldn't be part of the main conversation. But close enough that she could still keep an eye on me. A few minutes later, someone approached my table. It was Ryan, my sister's fiancé. He smiled and extended his hand. "You must be Elena," he said kindly. "Emily talks about you." I shook his hand. "Nice to meet you," I replied. "I'm glad you came," he said. Before I could answer, my mother suddenly appeared beside him. "Ryan, sweetheart," she said brightly. "Aunt Patricia just arrived. Come say hello." She gently placed her hand on his arm and guided him away before we could continue talking. I watched them walk back to the main table. Then I looked down at my water glass. Invisible again. But something unexpected happened a few minutes later. A woman seated near the head of the table was watching me. She had silver hair, sharp posture, and the kind of calm presence that made people listen when she spoke. This was Margaret Dalton, Ryan's mother. She had been quietly observing the room all evening. And after a while, she turned toward my mother and asked a simple question. "That young woman by the window," she said. "Is she also your daughter?" My mother hesitated. Just for a second. But that second was enough for me to notice. "Oh," she said lightly. "That's Elena." Then she added the word she always used when introducing me. "She's adopted." The conversation at the table continued. But Margaret Dalton wasn't finished. She glanced at me again, studying my face carefully. Like someone trying to remember where they had seen a person before. At the time, I didn't think much about it. But that quiet moment was the beginning of everything. Because within the next 30 minutes, my mother would say something about me that would make the entire room uncomfortable. And Margaret Dalton would finally realize exactly where she knew me from. And when that happened, the dinner would never be the same again. I'll tell you the exact moment my mother publicly humiliated me in front of everyone, and why Margaret Dalton suddenly became very interested in my job. Dinner started smoothly. Waiters brought out appetizers, glasses clinked softly, and the room filled with polite conversation. From my small table by the window, I watched my mother move from guest to guest like she was hosting a television show. Laughing. Telling stories. making sure everyone saw how proud she was of Emily. Every few minutes she mentioned something about my sister. Emily's dance awards. Emily's college achievements. Emily's bright future. I had heard this speech my entire life. But tonight, it felt louder. More exaggerated. Like she was performing. Eventually, the conversation at the main table turned toward family. And that's when Margaret Dalton asked another question. She looked toward my mother and said calmly, "So Elena is your older daughter?" My mother smiled, but the smile looked thin. "Yes," she said. Then she added something that made my stomach tighten. "Well, technically." A few people at the table leaned closer. Margaret raised an eyebrow slightly. "What do you mean?" My mother waved her hand casually. "Oh, Elena was adopted." She said it the same way someone might mention a small detail about the weather. Then she added with a light laugh, "She cleans houses for a living." A few guests chuckled politely. Not loud laughter. Just the uncomfortable kind people make when they aren't sure if they're supposed to laugh. I kept my eyes on my plate. But my father decided to add something. Without looking up from his food, he said calmly, "We gave up expecting much from her a long time ago." The words landed in the room like a dropped glass. No one said anything for a second. Forks paused. Conversations stopped. But then someone forced a quiet laugh, and the room slowly started moving again. From my table, 12 feet away, I heard every word clearly. My hands were resting in my lap under the table. I pressed my fingernails into my palm to keep my face calm. I had heard things like this before. Just never in front of 30 people. Then I noticed something strange. Margaret Dalton wasn't laughing. She wasn't even looking at my mother. She was looking directly at me. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Not with judgment. With curiosity. Like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Then she asked another question. "What company does she work for?" My mother shrugged. "Oh, some small cleaning service." "You don't know the name?" Margaret asked. "It's not important," my mother replied quickly. Margaret didn't respond. Instead, she turned slightly in her chair and looked at me again. Longer this time. Carefully. Like someone who had just recognized a familiar face but couldn't quite place where. I looked away. I didn't know why she was staring. I didn't know that somewhere in her memory, a name was slowly connecting to a face. And once she figured it out, this entire evening would collapse like a house of cards. But first, my mother had one more thing she wanted to do. She wanted to put me on display. And the next question she asked would put every eye in the room directly on me. My mother asks me to explain my little cleaning job to the entire table, and Margaret Dalton finally asks the question that changes everything. The waiters cleared the appetizer plates and brought out the main course. The room slowly filled again with conversation. Most people seemed ready to move past the awkward moment. But my mother wasn't finished. She turned slightly in her chair and looked toward my table. Then she smiled in that sweet voice she used whenever she wanted to appear generous. "Elena, honey," she said loudly. "Why don't you tell everyone what you're doing these days?" The room shifted instantly. 30 faces turned toward me. Forks paused in midair. Even the music from the ceiling speakers suddenly seemed louder. I slowly set my water glass down. "I run a residential cleaning company," I said calmly. Simple. Direct. No extra details. My mother laughed lightly. "Run is a generous word," she said to the table. A few small laughs followed. My father shook his head slowly like a disappointed teacher. "Don't pressure her," he said. "She's doing the best she can." Then he added quietly. "For someone like her." Someone like her. The words hung in the air. A woman near the end of the table shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Ryan looked down at his plate. Emily's eyes flicked toward me, then quickly back to the table. I kept my face calm. But under the table, my hand tightened into a fist. Then I noticed something. Margaret Dalton had set her fork down. She wasn't eating. She was watching me. Completely focused. Like the last piece of a puzzle had almost fallen into place. Then she leaned forward slightly. "May I ask something?" she said. My mother immediately answered for me. "Oh, really, Mrs. Dalton, it's not worth discussing." Margaret lifted one hand gently. I asked Elena. 3 simple words. But they stopped my mother instantly. Margaret turned her full attention toward me. "What is the name of your company?" For a moment, the room was silent again. I looked directly at her. Then I answered. "Whitman Clean Living." The name hung in the air. Margaret repeated it slowly. "Whitman Clean Living." Her eyes widened just slightly. Then she leaned back in her chair. Like someone who had finally solved the puzzle. Ryan noticed immediately. "Mom," he asked quietly. "What is it?" But Margaret didn't answer. Instead, she stood up calmly. "If you'll excuse me for a moment," she said. Then she walked toward the hallway that led to the restrooms. From my seat by the window, I could see through the glass wall of the hallway. Margaret stopped halfway down the corridor. She pulled her phone from her purse and began scrolling. She wasn't checking messages. She was searching for something. Back at the table, my mother leaned toward her friends and whispered loudly enough for me to hear. "Don't worry about it," she said with a small laugh. "It's just a little cleaning company." But down the hallway, Margaret suddenly stopped scrolling. Her thumb froze on the screen. Then slowly, she smiled. Not politely. Not socially. But the kind of smile someone makes when they've just confirmed something very important. She looked back toward the dining room. Her eyes met mine through the glass. And in that moment, I knew she had figured something out. And whatever it was, my mother was about to regret everything she had said that night. Margaret returns to the table, and my mother stands up to give a speech that will accidentally make the situation even worse. When Margaret Dalton returned to the dining room, something about her had changed. Her posture was straighter. Her expression calmer. But there was also a quiet confidence in her eyes. Like someone who knew something important and was simply waiting for the right moment to say it. Meanwhile, my mother was doing what she always did when she felt the room slipping away from her. She took control of it. She stood up and gently tapped a butter knife against her wine glass. Clink. Clink. The room quieted. "I'd like to say a few words," she announced. Everyone turned toward her. My mother placed a hand over her chest, the way she did when she wanted to look emotional. First, she began, smiling toward the Dalton family. "I want to thank Ryan and his wonderful family for welcoming our Emily with such kindness." Ryan smiled politely. Margaret simply watched. My mother continued. "Ryan, you are exactly the kind of man we prayed our daughter would marry." Then she turned toward my father. "And Daniel, thank you for standing beside me through all these years while we raised our beautiful family." My father raised his glass slightly. Several guests nodded approvingly. Finally, my mother looked at my sister. "Emily," she said warmly, "you are our pride. Everything your father and I worked for is right here in this moment." Emily smiled nervously. But then my mother added something that made my stomach drop. "Our only pride." She said it while I was sitting less than 15 feet away. She didn't even glance at me. Some guests clapped softly. Others looked uncomfortable but joined the applause anyway. My mother wiped an imaginary tear from her eye. Our family hasn't always been perfect, she continued. We've had challenges. This time she did glance in my direction. Just long enough for everyone to understand exactly who she meant. But tonight isn't about those difficulties, she said quickly. Tonight is about love. More polite clapping followed. But before the room could fully relax again, another chair moved. The sound was small, but everyone heard it. Margaret Dalton stood up slowly. She placed both hands lightly on the table. I would also like to say a few words, she said calmly. The room turned toward her. Margaret didn't rush. She waited until every person in the room was paying attention. Then she looked directly at my mother. Linda, she began politely, I've been listening carefully all evening. My mother smiled nervously. That's very kind of you. Margaret raised one finger gently. Please let me finish. Her voice was calm. But something in it made the entire room grow still. I've heard you describe your family, Margaret continued. And I've heard how you speak about your daughters. My mother shifted slightly in her chair. But there's something important this room should know, Margaret said. She paused. And in that moment, the air in the room felt heavier. Because Margaret Dalton was about to say something that would change the entire night. Something that would make 30 people turn and look at me in a completely different way. My mother had spent years telling people who she thought I was. But Margaret Dalton was about to reveal who I actually was. And once she did, nothing my parents said would ever sound the same again. Margaret finally reveals how she knows me. And the entire room learns the truth about the girl who cleans houses. Margaret Dalton stood calmly at the head of the table. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush. But somehow, every person in the room was completely focused on her. Linda, she said politely to my mother, I need to say something about Elena. My mother blinked, clearly confused. I'm not sure what you mean, she replied with a tight smile. Margaret turned slightly and looked toward me. Then she looked back at the table. Elena Carter was not a stranger to me. The room shifted. Ryan frowned slightly. You know Elena? He asked. Margaret nodded slowly. Yes, she said. I do. My mother laughed nervously. Well, that's surprising, she said quickly. I didn't realize our Elena had made connections like that. Margaret ignored the comment. Instead, she spoke clearly. Last year, I read an article in a national business magazine. She paused, letting the room settle. It was a feature about successful franchise founders under 40. Now several people were listening very closely. Margaret continued. The article described a company that started with one woman cleaning houses by herself. A few people at the table glanced toward me. But over the course of 14 years, Margaret said, that company expanded across multiple states. She folded her hands lightly in front of her. 14 states, to be exact. Someone whispered softly. What? Margaret continued calmly. The company now employs dozens of people and generates millions in annual revenue. My mother frowned. I'm sorry, she said impatiently. I'm not sure what that has to do with. Margaret turned toward her. That company, she said clearly, is Whitman Clean Living. The room went silent again. Margaret then looked directly at me. And the woman who founded that company is Elena. For a moment, no one spoke. Forks stopped moving. Glasses froze halfway to lips. My mother stared at Margaret like she had misunderstood the sentence. That's not possible, she said quietly. Margaret tilted her head slightly. It's very possible. Then she added the sentence that completely changed the room. I know because I invested in her company 2 years ago. Now the silence was different. Heavier. My father slowly set his drink down on the table. My sister covered her mouth with her hand. Someone at the far end of the table whispered. Wait, she owns the company? Margaret continued calmly. Yes. She glanced toward me again. Elena built one of the fastest-growing residential cleaning franchises in the region. Then she looked back at my mother. The last financial report I saw showed approximately $2.8 million in annual revenue. The number landed like thunder. My mother's hand tightened around her wine glass. My father stared at me like he was seeing a stranger. Around the table, people began quietly asking questions. 14 states? How many employees? When did this happen? For the first time all evening. No one was laughing at me. They were staring at me. And the most uncomfortable person in the entire room was my mother. Because in one calm speech, Margaret Dalton had just undone every story my parents had told about me for the last 29 years. But what happened next made the moment even worse for them. Because suddenly, everyone wanted to talk to the daughter they gave up on. The entire room begins asking me questions, and my mother desperately tries to rewrite the story she told just minutes earlier. For a few seconds after Margaret finished speaking, the room stayed completely still. 30 people sat frozen in their chairs, trying to process what they had just heard. Then the whispers started. 14 states? Did she say millions? How many employees did she mention? My father looked down at the tablecloth like the answer might be written there. My mother looked like someone had just pulled the floor out from under her. Her smile had completely disappeared. Meanwhile, Ryan's uncle, a tall man with a gray beard who had asked about my job earlier, slowly turned his chair toward me. So wait, he said carefully. You actually run the company? I nodded. Yes. How many employees? He asked. 87, I said. His eyebrows shot up. Full-time? Most of them, I replied. A woman across the table leaned forward. And you operate in 14 states? Yes. Another guest spoke up. How did you expand that quickly? Within seconds, the focus of the entire room had shifted. People who had ignored me earlier were now leaning closer. Listening carefully. Asking questions. I wasn't the embarrassing daughter anymore. I was suddenly the most interesting person in the room. And my mother could see it happening. I watched her face carefully. First came shock. Then calculation. Then, finally, recovery mode. She straightened in her chair and forced a bright smile. Well, she said loudly, I always knew Elena had potential. A few guests looked at her. My mother nodded confidently, as if this had been obvious all along. Didn't I say that, Daniel? She added quickly. My father hesitated. Yes, he muttered. My mother continued speaking, trying to regain control of the room. We've always supported her, she said. Every step of the way. That's when Margaret Dalton spoke again. Linda. Her voice was calm. But it cut through the conversation instantly. 24 heads turned back toward the head of the table. Margaret looked directly at my mother. Just a few minutes ago, she said quietly, you told this room that Elena's business was a van and some buckets. The silence that followed felt heavy. No one laughed. No one defended my mother. They had all heard it. My mother opened her mouth. Closed it. Then opened it again. Nothing came out. Even her closest friend, Sandra, slowly slid her chair a few inches away from her. The scraping sound against the floor echoed in the quiet room. My father stared at the spilled drink in front of him, saying nothing. And for the first time in my entire life, my mother had no words. The story she had told about me for nearly 3 decades had collapsed in front of 30 witnesses. But the most important moment of the night wasn't the reveal. It was what I chose to do next. Because I didn't come to that dinner to prove anything. And I wasn't going to stay there and argue. Instead, I stood up. And what I said before leaving the room changed the entire night even more. I finally speak directly to my parents, and make a decision that no one at that table expected. The room was still completely silent. No one was eating anymore. No one was talking. Every person in the room was watching the same thing. Me. For most of my life, I had imagined a moment like this. A moment where my parents would finally understand who I had become. Where they would realize they were wrong about me. But now that the moment was here, I didn't feel victory. I felt tired. Very tired. Slowly, I pushed my chair back and stood up. The small scraping sound of the chair against the floor seemed louder than anything else in the room. My mother gripped her wine glass tightly. "Elena," she said nervously. But I didn't answer her. Instead, I folded my napkin neatly and placed it beside my plate. "I didn't come here tonight to prove anything," I said calmly. My voice was steady. Even though my chest felt heavy. "I came because Emily asked me to," I continued. I turned toward my sister. "She's my sister. I love her. And I wanted to be here for her." Emily's eyes were already filling with tears. Then I looked at my parents. Both of them. "I've spent most of my life sitting at tables like this," I said quietly. Tables where people talked about me like I wasn't in the room. No one moved. But I'm not doing that anymore. My mother's face tightened. "Elena, don't be dramatic," she said quickly. I ignored the comment. "I won't stay anywhere my existence is treated like an embarrassment," I said. The words hung in the air. No anger. No shouting. Just truth. Then I turned toward Margaret Dalton. "Thank you," I said sincerely. She nodded once. She understood. Not because she revealed my company. But because she had done something no one else in that room had done. She had asked about me. Finally, I turned back to my sister. Emily was crying quietly now. "Elena," she whispered. I stepped closer to her. "I love you," I said softly. "And I hope your life with Ryan is everything you want it to be." Then I paused. "But after tonight, I need some space." Emily nodded slowly. She didn't argue. Deep down, she knew why. I picked up my jacket from the back of my chair. Then I walked past the long table. Past the guests who had spent the evening watching my parents erase me. Past the candles. Past the quiet room. No one stopped me. No one spoke. I didn't slam the door. I didn't run. I simply walked out of the restaurant. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped into the parking lot. Crickets were chirping. The world outside the restaurant was calm. I sat in my car for 7 minutes before starting the engine. 7 quiet minutes where I realized something important. For the first time in my life, I had chosen my own dignity over their approval. But the story didn't end when I left the restaurant. Because what happened after I walked out caused even bigger problems for my parents. And later that night, my sister called me with news I didn't expect. Emily tells me what happened inside the restaurant after I left, and why the entire evening completely fell apart for my parents. I was sitting on my couch when my phone rang. It was already late. The clock on the wall read 11:14 p.m. I had changed into comfortable clothes and made a cup of tea, but I hadn't taken more than 2 sips. My mind was still replaying everything that happened at the restaurant. When I saw Emily's name on my phone, I hesitated. Then I answered. "Hey," I said. Her voice sounded tired. "Elena. I need to tell you what happened after you left." I leaned back on the couch. "Okay," I said. There was a long pause on the other end of the phone. Then Emily sighed. At first, Mom tried to act like nothing happened. I could picture it perfectly. What do you mean? I asked. She laughed and told everyone you've always been dramatic, Emily said quietly. She said you misunderstood what she meant. That sounded exactly like my mother. Trying to rewrite the story before anyone else could repeat it. But here's the problem, Emily continued. Everyone heard what she said. I didn't respond. Because that part didn't surprise me. The room got really uncomfortable, Emily said. People started whispering to each other. And Margaret? I asked. Emily exhaled slowly. She was very calm. That sentence made me sit up a little. What did she say? Emily's voice lowered. She looked at Ryan and said, We'll talk about this later at home. Something about that sounded serious. Then Emily continued. Dad tried to fix things. That made me almost laugh. How? He leaned toward Margaret and said he hoped the evening wouldn't affect the wedding. And? Emily paused. Margaret cut him off. My curiosity grew. What did she say? Emily repeated the sentence exactly. She said, Mr. Carter, I'm not judging your daughter. I'm judging how you treat her. I stayed quiet. Because those words hit harder than anything else that night. Emily continued describing the rest of the evening. After that, the room changed. Guests who had been laughing earlier were suddenly quiet. Some people started leaving early. One couple said they had to get home for their babysitter. Another said they had a long drive. Within 30 minutes, several guests were gone. And Mom? I asked. She went to the restroom, Emily said. For a while. How long? 12 minutes. I could imagine her standing in front of the mirror trying to fix her makeup and figure out how the evening had gone so wrong. When she came back, Emily said softly, her mascara was smudged. No one mentioned it. I didn't feel happy hearing that. I didn't feel revenge. Mostly. I felt exhausted. I hope she's okay, I said quietly. Emily didn't respond right away. Finally she said, Elena, everything is different now. What do you mean? The whole town is going to hear about this. And she was right. Because Pine Hollow was the kind of town where news traveled fast. But neither of us realized how quickly the story of that dinner would spread. And the damage it would cause my parents' reputation. But something else happened after that night too. Something I never expected. Emily began seeing our family very differently. And eventually, she showed up at my front door. For the first real conversation we had ever had as sisters. The story spreads across town, the wedding is suddenly postponed. And Emily comes to visit the life I built without our parents. In a town like Pine Hollow, news doesn't travel slowly. It explodes. By Monday morning, the story from the engagement dinner had spread across town. At the grocery store. At the church parking lot. At the hair salon. People were whispering about the same thing. Did you hear what happened at the Carter dinner? Everyone had their own version of the story. Some said I owned a company with 100 employees. Others said I had made millions overnight. One person even claimed Margaret Dalton wrote me a giant check during dinner. None of those details were accurate. But the most important part of the story was Linda Carter had publicly humiliated her daughter. And it had backfired. My mother had spent nearly 20 years building her reputation in town. She ran charity events at church. She organized community fundraisers. She was always the first to volunteer for anything that made her look helpful and generous. But now people were asking questions. The following Tuesday, two families quietly left her church prayer group. No arguments. No explanation. Just absence. A day later, my mother's closest friend Sandra finally called her. Not to comfort her. To warn her. Linda, Sandra said over the phone, you need to call Elena and apologize. My mother was shocked. Apologize for what? She demanded. Sandra didn't hesitate. For humiliating her in front of 30 people. My mother grew defensive immediately. I'm her mother, she snapped. I have the right to say what I want about my own child. Sandra's voice became firm. You have the right to be her mother, she said. You don't have the right to tear her down in public. Then Sandra hung up. And she didn't answer the next 3 calls my mother made. Meanwhile, another problem appeared. The wedding. A week after the dinner, Ryan asked Emily to meet him for coffee. They sat together at a quiet diner halfway between Pine Hollow and the city where he lived. Emily later told me about that conversation. Ryan held her hands across the table. I love you, he said. That hasn't changed. Emily felt relieved. But then he continued. However, I need to understand your family before we get married. Emily didn't argue. She already knew what he meant. What are you asking? She said quietly. Ryan took a breath. Family counseling, he said. 6 sessions. At least. Emily blinked. For who? For all of us, he said. Your parents too. He leaned closer. I'm not asking you to choose between me and them, he said. I'm asking you to see what I saw that night. Emily agreed. Which meant something very unusual was happening in our family. For the first time in decades. Someone was questioning the story my mother had always told. But the biggest surprise came a few weeks later. On a quiet Sunday afternoon. When someone knocked on my front door. I opened it. And standing there was Emily. She had never visited my house before. And the moment she stepped inside, she finally saw the life I had built without our parents. But what she said next was something I had waited my entire life to hear. Emily apologizes for the years of silence. And I explain the most important lesson I learned from walking away from a toxic table. 3 weeks after the engagement dinner, someone knocked on my door. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon. I looked through the window and saw Emily standing on my porch. She looked nervous. Not the kind of nervous you feel before giving a speech. The kind you feel when you know you're about to face something difficult. I opened the door. Hey, I said. Hey, she replied softly. For a moment we just stood there. Then she stepped inside. Emily walked slowly through my living room like she was visiting a place she had heard about but never seen. My house wasn't fancy. 3 bedrooms. Simple furniture. A small porch with 2 rocking chairs I had bought years earlier. But it was peaceful. And it was mine. Emily stopped in front of a framed photograph hanging on the wall. It showed an elderly woman sitting at a kitchen table, smiling warmly. Who's that? She asked. That's Mrs. Whitman, I said. My first client. Emily studied the photo. She looks kind. She was, I replied. She's the reason I never gave up. Emily turned toward me. Her eyes were already red. Elena, she said quietly. I'm sorry. I shook my head. You don't need to apologize for Mom. But she shook her head too. No, she said. I'm apologizing for me. Her voice cracked slightly. For knowing how they treated you, and staying quiet. She looked down at the floor. Every holiday, every dinner, every time Mom said something cruel. I just sat there. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. I didn't rush to comfort her. Because what she said was true. But I also understood something. You were surviving the same house, I said gently. Just from the other side of the door. Emily wiped her eyes. Then she sat on the couch and looked around again. I didn't know any of this, she said. Your company. Your life. I smiled slightly. That's because no one ever asked. She nodded slowly. Tell me about it, she said. And for the next 3 hours. We talked. Not about childhood arguments. Not about our parents. But about normal things. Employees. New business locations. Funny stories about cleaning disasters. The time a new worker accidentally broke an expensive chandelier. For the first time in years. We talked like sisters. Before she left, Emily stood by the door and hugged me tightly. I'm glad you came to the dinner, she said. Even if everything exploded. I smiled. Sometimes things need to break, I said. So something honest can finally grow. After she left, I sat on the porch for a while and thought about everything that had happened. My parents never apologized. My father never called. And honestly, I don't know if they ever will. But I learned something important that night. You don't need someone else's approval to build a meaningful life. You don't need people who refuse to see your worth. And you don't have to sit at a table where you're treated like an embarrassment. Because sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand up, walk away, and build a life so full that their opinion no longer matters. My name is Elena Carter. I started with a bucket, a sponge, and one client who believed in me. And even when my own family refused to see me, I built something that spoke for itself. And maybe, if you've ever felt like the invisible person at the table, this story is a reminder. You are not invisible. You are just in the wrong room. And the moment you walk out, your real life can finally begin.